Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 5 from M83, Saturdays Equals Youth. So, y'all like the 1980s? Because it's time for yet another new era in the M83 story, their 80s revivalism era. Having mostly focused on synth-flex blends of noise rock and shoegaze previously, this album shows them toning down the rougher, clipping-heavy aesthetic and replacing it with more of an overtly electronic aesthetic that is much more synth-pop than it is shoegaze. Directly aiming to recapture nostalgia for that era, not just through the surface-level sound of it, but especially trying to capture the heart and emotionality of the music from that era, right down to the album cover, which seems like an homage to John Hughes movies, especially like The Breakfast Club. Of course, there's still lots of guitars and live drumming and everything. They're still recognizable as the same band, sitting on the border of rock and electronic as they always have. And in fact, this album shows M83 upgrading once again from a glorified Anthony Gonzalez solo project to an actual full band. At least it's credited as the trio of Gonzalez, alongside Loic Moran on drums, bass, and keyboards, as well as a new member in vocalist and keyboardist Morgan Kibbe. The latter would go on to have minimal influence on their next album and break off the band shortly afterwards to be rotated out with other female guest singers. But on this album in particular, she is a more present force than maybe any other guest vocalist has been on an M83 album. Even co-writing 4 different tracks. Well, I guess Mylon had the same amount of co-writing credits on Junk 8 years later, but he was never considered an official member of the band like Kibbe was. But anyway, as for my own personal connection with this album, I will say if you would talk to me at any time over the past couple of years, I might have said this was my second favorite M83 album. It has always been one of the more popular choices among fans as their best work, and I remember really liking it when I did my first full marathon of their albums in preparation for my review of Junk. But at the same time, I also don't think I'd actually come back to listen to this one a single time since doing that marathon. Whenever I'd be in the mood for synth-pop M83, I'd be way more likely to come back to their next album, which I felt accomplished a similar sound and did it even better. If I had to be brutally honest, I've probably come back to their self-titled more often than I've come back to this one. And as I've sat with this album over the past couple of weeks and pinned down some more solidified thoughts on it, okay, this is still absolutely one of their best albums. I think the lack of replay value it got for me in previous years more comes from my somewhat mixed relationship with 80s music in general. I think my opinion on this one now is that while the vast majority of their other albums have higher high points that connected with me more deeply, this is probably the most consistent M83 album. The one that I have the least to complain about, aside from the obvious one. It has its share of great moments, and out of its 11 tracks, I can't mark any as skips or even think that there's big a gap in quality between the highest and lowest points. And that does mean that, oddly enough, this is going to get a slightly higher score for me than other albums of theirs that have brought me in a lot more frequently for repeat visits. Now, I may as well get my least favorite moments on the album out of the way first, because weirdly enough, these tended to be among the bigger singles, and they're tracks that I suspect are major favorites for most people. Tracks like Graveyard Girl, We Own the Sky, and Dark Moves of Love feel like they're trying to recapture some of that new wave sound of the mid-later 80s. Following in the footsteps of bands like the Psychedelic Furs and Aha and all those. And the sound is played super straight. They just deliver really simple pop rock tunes with big anthemic guitar riffs and banging acoustic drums. Well, We Own the Sky is more synth pop than those other two and has more crisp 80s drum machines. It is probably my favorite of those 3 as a result. But that one also does feel like it's trying to recapture that old sound in a really plain and straightforward way. Now, these tracks are good, but they never really connected with me on all that deep a level. They always felt more the kind of music that my mom really likes than the kind of stuff that I would ever go out of my way to listen to. Not to mention, I did always feel like the drumming on Graveyard Girl and Dark Moves of Love in particular was kinda weak, a little too low mixed for its own good, and would get overpowered by the guitars, leading to these tracks not having as much visceral punch as I'd want. Graveyard Girl does somewhat make up for it with one of the more memorable tunes and some lyrics that do feel like they paint more of a specific portrait than most M83 lyrics do. And Dark Moves of Love is mostly just kind of forgettable. But in any case, if you are really into that specific era of 80s new wave, I would really easily see these being your favorites and resonating with you a lot more deeply than they do for me. Even if I'm not as openly drawn to them as many other cuts here, I can absolutely respect what they're going for, and I'd still probably take these over some of the more abrasive noise-heavy moments earlier on in their catalog. While I'm at it, another track that I've had mixed feelings on is the closer, Midnight Souls Still Remain, which I really like in concept. It's literally just an 11-minute straight ambient piece, which focuses on nothing but minimalistic progressions of warm synth pads, and takes the album out on a suitably fuzzy and nostalgic note. Copying this note from a lot of other reviews I've seen, but if this album were a movie, this track is the closing credits. In execution, though, I couldn't honestly mark this as a favorite since there is pretty much nothing to it at all. It slowly shifts between the same two chords for its entire running time, and there is no further progression. And again, 11 minutes long. A piece this long and monolithic on an album like this did occasionally test my patience, and whenever it would come up, I would already know the album wouldn't have anything more to offer. I do feel like it's less interesting or easy to sink myself into in comparison with the similar ambient pieces on, say, Digital Shades Volume 1. On the merits of its length and lack of development alone, it is the only cut here I've ever felt the urge to just skip without finishing it in full. However, I do still typically just stick it out anyway, because it is still nice, and I do appreciate a track like this being here in the first place. I might not have even complained about it at all if it had ended like maybe just 3 minutes earlier than it did. But yeah, those are the lower points. Beyond that, pretty much all the other tracks here are really damn good. I'd say my favorite stretch of the album is probably the first 3 tracks. You Appearing is a really nice and alluring mix of piano and synth buildups that start out warm and nostalgic, and the sound gets thicker and more epic as the track goes on, with various disconnected sung vocal interjections. Great intro to this thing. And then that segues directly into Kim and Jessie, which is another really straightforward synth pop cut, except I liked this one a lot more than the other just super straightforward synth pop cuts here. It's probably catchier too. You got lots more anthemic guitars and thick synth pads and banging 80s percussion, with Gonzalez's fairly understated performance, thankfully never attempting to hit any notes out of his comfortable range. There's also these kind of whooping sounds that are somewhere between vocals and synths placed in the background, which are pretty nice, give the track that much more of a soaring quality to it, the kind of which make me feel like this is acting as a direct precursor to their biggest hit. Great cut, but strangely enough, what consistently stood out to me as my favorite track on the album is a deep cut. The following track, Skin of the Night. I did not expect this, because I didn't even remember this track at all, but like, this is our first lead vocal performance from Morgan Kibbe, and she is easily the star of the show here. I mean, instrumentally it may not be anything all that to write home about. Lots of the usual 80s guitars and synth pads with some crisp but fairly cliche mixes of synthetic 80s percussion, and the lyrics, which may or may not be about like a vampire girl or something, and they're a little weird. But goddamn, the way her understated vocal melody goes up next to Gonzalez and the way they play off each other, it just sounds absolutely transcendent. This is such a damn excellent slow burn cut, and I love everything about the way it sounds. And while I'm on the topic of Morgan Kibbe, she also steals the show in her performance on the track Up, which itself is as blatant a Kate Bush homage as one can possibly get, with Kibbe almost perfectly mimicking Bush's vocal range and inflections, and even name-dropping Hounds of Love for good measure in case you didn't get the reference. Oh, excuse me, Hounds of Law. Sure, definitely didn't just write it that way in the official lyrics to avoid a possible lawsuit. Now, obviously none of that is a complaint. Even if I have little to no personal history with Kate Bush and didn't grow up with any of her stuff, I do think this is a faithful recreation of her one-of-a-kind style that happens to have a strong enough tune to be able to stand on its own. I'd definitely mark that as one of my favorite cuts here. Should really listen to more Kate Bush sometime. Beyond that, there's also a couple of more instrumental-leaning cuts, including the 8-minute lead single, Couleurs, which of course that one had to be a favorite of mine as well, 8-minute instrumental, but it's just got lots of epic walls of synth pads, building leads, rounded bass lines, punchy TR-808 percussion. It's big, soaring, cinematic, driving, monolithic, impressive, delivers what you'd want out of an M83 track of this length. I mean, it might surprise people more that this wasn't my favorite cut on the album, but it's definitely right up there. Also quite liked Highway of Endless Dreams, which is just as epic and provides just as much of a steady build, but mostly does so with 80s guitar layering instead. Really keeps you on the edge of your seat, and I like how it takes such a long time for any drums to show up. And the only other track to mention is Too Late, one last straightforward, heartfelt piano ballad with Gonzalez's fairly understated performance. Sits in line with the more piano-driven moments from Before the Dawn Heals Us, like Safe or Let Men Burn Stars, and is perhaps even a bit more subtle than those. Might prefer those older ones, but it would be close. If the album ended with this cut, I think that would have been a really strong finish, but is what it is. So that's everything on Saturdays Equals Youth. This has admittedly been a weird album for me to parse and figure out how it might sit in their catalog. As much as I love moments on here like Skin of the Night, Couleurs, You Appearing, Kim and Jessie, or Up, I'm not sure how strongly they'd fare against my favorite moments from all the other M83 albums. This album does also kind of feel like it ran out of steam a bit in its final stretch, and there is a part of me who kind of wishes the album ended 2 tracks earlier than it did. And of course, there is the obvious complaint one could level at this album in that it is super derivative and doing everything it can to recapture an old sound. But, I don't know. I never felt like the overwhelming 80s-ness of this album prevented it from hitting as hard as it could. And you're talking to a guy who never had that deep a connection with 80s music to begin with, and who's gotten really sick of more recent brands of 80s revivalism. The thing about this album, though, is that not only does it kind of feel like it can get a pass thanks to having predated the overwhelming amount of 80s fetishism we've gotten throughout the 2010s, and felt like it was doing something more original from like a 2008 perspective, but even if this came out now, it wouldn't get on my nerves either, because it's way too earnest and innocent. Like I said, Gonzalez's primary preoccupation wasn't so much the sound of the 80s, which he did nail anyway, but more the heart of it. The fact that a lot of those old classic new wave and synth pop tracks of the era like I Melt With You and Take On Me and all those others could really get emotionally vulnerable. And this album really did a good job to capture that without ever playing into the decade's occasional goofiness. And that's obviously not to say I don't enjoy the goofier sides of the 80s too. There exist albums like Cut Copies and Ghost Colors, or of course M83's Junk, that can evoke the goofiness of the 80s without getting it to undercut the emotional core of the music, but never mind that. This was an album that strikes me as being about Gonzalez's own memories of growing up in the 80s and trying to reconnect with his own childhood. And I do think that this is one of his most mature explorations of that theme that's run through the whole M83 catalog. This isn't my favorite 80s revival album ever or anything. I don't think it's among the most interesting entrants in their catalog, but it is just varied enough to still connect with me in that way regardless. And despite this style not often being my thing, it did turn out to fit perfectly with M83's ethos, and I think they'd go on to even further improve upon this sound and make it even more their own with their next album. But yeah, I've been tossing around a lot of conflicted thoughts with this project, but I think all of this adds up to Saturdays Equals Youth just barely getting away with the lightest possible solid 8 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.